When many of us think of a druid or a witch, we either think of somebody out in the middle of the woods, standing in front of a cauldron, chanting mystical phrases into the steam rising from the pot. Or we think of somebody who can light candles with a wave of their hand and cast spells that make fireballs appear, lightning strike from their fingertips. Our idea of magic has been greatly shaped by our literature and movies. And in all of these places, they exaggerate. But that doesn't mean that there isn't great power in being a witch or a druid. But that power begins very subtly, learning the power of blessing. So as we begin this episode of Druidcraft 101, I hope you are ready to explore and find that way of blessing as we walk together down creation's paths. Hello, everyone. How are you all doing today? My name is Charlie. I am a Christopagan Druid and priest of Bridget.
Hello, everyone. I am doing well. My name is Brian. I'm a Christopagan Druid and sous chef to the Dagda.
Today, we're going to be diving into Chapter 2 of Druidcraft by Philip Carr-Gomm. If you remember in our previous episode in our Druidcraft 101 series, we encouraged you to go get a copy of the book and be ready to do a deep dive into the contents there. We are going to be covering what he does in this chapter, but I'm not going to be retelling all of the stories that are in there. So please, if you are not following along well and you haven't read the book, it's not a very expensive book. You can get it digitally. You can get it on Audible. You can get it as a paper book, whatever. Be sure to get your copy so that you can follow along with these main chapter breakdowns. We'll have other episodes in this series like tomorrow's where we're going in deeper on some of these ideas, but please make sure you have a copy of the book. So in chapter 2, we talked about the story of the Selkie, the law of the returning tide, and the way of blessing. He also offered a way to connect to these energies through invoking my beloved Bridget, which I have to say is not a bad way to get started. So hopefully you're primed and ready because we are going to dive right in to this first lesson, the way of blessing. But before we do that, if you haven't already, don't forget to like, subscribe, follow, whatever the terminology happens to be on whatever app you're listening to us on. We do original Christopagan and Druid episodes 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, and you don't want to miss a thing. All right, let's just get into it. So the chapter begins with us heading to Avranel and listening to the Bard's tale. This story is the story of the Selkie, which is about a group of people that live off the shore as seals. And once a year on Bieltana, they come ashore, take off their seal skins, and frolic on the beach as humans, making love on the sand, and then putting their skins back on and returning to the sea. Except for 1 year, when Taggart steals one of the Selkie's skins, basically coerces her against her will to agree to stay with him for 7 years and be his wife, at which point she bears a son that may be his son, may be the child of the Selkie she was just with. He doesn't know. And I think in a very interesting layer on the story, he doesn't seem to care. And yeah, keeps her in bondage to him for 7 years, at the end of which she expects the contract to be done and for her to be able to return to the sea. And he says no. At which point her son, after seeing his father leave for the day, sneaks up to where his father has hidden her skin to give it to her so that she can return to the sea. Now, this story is a deep dive into kind of the two paths that we have before us. And that is the path of selfishness and the path of selflessness. These often get misconstrued and misunderstood. Selfishness is when you always, or at least most of the time, place your needs and benefits above those of others. Whereas selflessness is when you put other people's needs before your own. Now, there's a catch in this. Notice we're talking about superseding someone else's will. It'd be one thing for Taggart to just sit back and say, oh, I wish I had a Selkie wife, and then find a way to, maybe talk to her and woo her and get her to fall in love with them or something. And this is not the path that he takes. He decides to superimpose his will onto her by stealing her skin and hiding it so she can't return to the sea. This action causes her a great deal of suffering as her skin begins to crack and her eyes begin to water constantly because she is drying out from not living in the realm that she is intended to be in. This is a very simple and clear way to see selfishness. Selfishness is not looking out for yourself and your own best interests. Selfishness is imposing your will on others. You need to take care of yourself. If you fall apart, you've fallen apart. You need to make sure that you are doing what you need to do to keep yourself healthy and strong and mentally strong for this world. That ability to do self-care ends where it starts affecting other people. Expecting other people to do exactly what you want them to do because you want them to do it, that's crossing the line into selfishness. And that's where Taggart gets himself in trouble.
especially when it's done without any consideration for the other party.
Yeah,
Just
absolutely not.
she clearly states the amount of suffering that she'll have to be in to maintain and stay where she is. And it's like there's no care or concern or consideration for it
Right from the beginning, she tells him,
right from the beginning.
and he doesn't care. He wants her to be his wife because she's so pretty and he wants it. He wants her. And I say it, I think it might actually be a better way to phrase it because he has truly dehumanized her into a possession.
Yeah.
And we see this as the story unfolds. She and her son develop a caring and loving relationship with each other. As the story tells us, she learned to see some of his good qualities, but never came to love him because love requires space, and he gave her no space. And this is a really powerful way to start seeing our relationship to life. This chapter, we're also introduced to the law of the returning tide. And we're actually introduced to it at the end of the story, where her son gives her her skin back and she returns to the ocean, but every day returns to the shore with two large fish that she leaves on a rock, staring at her son with tears in her eyes. Every day, even as badly as she was treated on land, and she knows the selfishness of Taggart, so she doesn't bring one fish because Taggart would eat it, or Taggart would cut it up and take the lion's share for himself, right? She returns with two. That way, her son gets a fish, and she's doing as best she can to take care of her kid. This is the law of the returning tide. And if you really want to go into a lot of depths with this, we've already done a full episode on the law of the returning tide, which we'll put in the playlist on our YouTube channel. That'll have all of our Druidcraft 101 episodes, as well as any episodes we've recorded previously on these topics that will help you go a little bit deeper in here. But the law of the returning tide is kind of like karma, but different in that it teaches us the rhythm and reciprocity of nature, that we're all living, if you will, at the shore of the sea, and whatever we cast out into the sea has an effect on the sea. And so whatever comes back to us will be affected by that.
One of the things I really enjoy about this chapter is before they even get into talking about the law of returning tide, they remind us that a lot of this is about living in right relationship. Is all of this about that right relationships, and the law of returning tide is just that. It's learning to live in right relationship with the general ebb and flow of the energies that we engage with, and hopefully learn to take conscious action and to act upon as well. In the law, as it states, we put out, we'll go out with all the others and stuff will wash back up. And just like with the ocean, if we live in right relationship with the ocean, we're putting good things into it. We're being good stewards of the ocean, not overfishing. We're not dumping trash into it. And the ocean will provide food. It will provide, if you look at those cultures that live by the ocean that have that right relationship, or you can look at examples of bad relationship we have in life where we dump pollution, we dump trash in the ocean, kills off the wildlife, so there's less fish to eat. The ocean doesn't feed us as well then. The shores get ugly because it gets covered in pollution and the trash that washes back up. And it's just really neat that they started with that right relationship and reminding us that that is the fuel behind the whole part of the law of returning tide.
Yeah, if you really want to dig into that, just study the history of the Chesapeake Bay because it was seen just as a place for commerce. So they kept dredging in the water and dredging the water and dumping all manner of pollutants into the water and kept dredging it. What they were doing without realizing is they were pulling all of the clams and oysters and all of the things that filtered and cleaned the water out of the water while adding all of these horrible things into the water. And it just got worse and worse and worse until the Chesapeake Restoration Project got started and started making sure that there were still clams and oysters and whatnot in the water, and being much more mindful about any dredging that happened, and really bringing life and restoring life back to the Chesapeake. Because the great thing about a natural system is balance can usually be restored. And I say usually because, once you've gone to the point of making something extinct, it's really hard to come back from that. I'm saying it that way because it looks like we may be about to bring the thylacine back. And that's just wild to me. She also brings up the idea in here, not just of seeing this as an ocean, but seeing it as the web of weird. And this is one of my favorite analogies for this. And if you're trying to search this on the internet, that's weird with a Y, W-Y-R-D. This is the old Anglo-Saxon word for fate, for chance, for luck. And weird is a very complex and complicated idea, but the basic idea of it is that we are all kind of interconnected, that the threads of our lives loop through and around and get intertwined with the threads of all other people and things that we come into contact with. If we're not mindful about how we're weaving that thread, we can tie ourselves down and we can prevent ourselves from having the forward motion and life that we want to have because we've created a knot. So the thread isn't flowing anymore. The thread is stuck. And these are moments of extreme conflict. We can kind of see this in our country right now. We've kind of created a knot. And there's only two ways to deal with a knot. And that's either to cut it out and weave new threads in, or to find a way to untangle the knot. Those are the options before you. And sometimes only certain threads have to be cut. And figuring out what those are, what fates have intertwined to bring us to the place that we are today. Once you start learning to see your life like this, and we're going to actually talk about that a lot more on tomorrow's episode when we talk about re-enchanting your life. But once you start seeing your life as this series of interconnected threads, that some of which you are weaving, some of which are being woven by those around you, and start seeing exactly what you're putting into the weave, you start getting a better understanding of how you can move forward in a lot of situations that sometimes feel like there's no way forward. And as always, that begins with cultivating a certain sense of mindfulness, because mindfulness is the heart of all of this practice. If you don't notice the blessings that you're putting out or the blessings that are being bestowed on you, they will wash over you without note. If you're not paying attention to the tide and what the tide is bringing back, yet you're still going to get sick when the red tide comes in, but you're going to be pointing at everything other than the algae, the cause of that illness. The awareness, mindfulness, helps you to see what is actually going on around you. And then you can actually start making the changes that you want to change. You'll notice that Philip uses a lot of analogies in this chapter, but there are a lot of ways to think about how to perform this work. And the one that we're going to spend the rest of this episode talking about is that of the spiritual gardener, learning the art of spiritual gardening and seeing the actions that we are putting out into the world like seeds. You don't just put a seed directly into the ground. If you've never done gardening, if you've never lived on a farm, you might not actually know that. There are things that you have to do to prepare the ground for the seeds. You have to till the ground. You have to soften it up because sometimes it's just too hard. You have to do things, give treatments to the land so that it will definitely feed and sustain the crop that you're putting down on it, because there may be too much clay in your soil. It may be too acidic. It may not have enough phosphorus or any of the other elements that are necessary to grow good plants.
Planning is also knowing when the weather will be most favorable for what crop you're trying to grow, knowing that this crop wants more water, maybe it can handle some of the cold. You might do it more in the spring, but if it likes it drier and hotter, you might try to time it for the summer. Most of them, you're not going to try to plant in the winter because A, the ground's going to be hard to work with, and B, it's going to probably be too cold for the plant to grow, which is also important to be mindful of. in the planning.
It's very important. And it's something that's so easy to miss because we have to learn how to nurture this kind of growth, this kind of these spiritual seeds through our intention and our love. Because if that's what we want back, if we want love back, if we want prosperity back, if we want generosity to fill our lives, if we want any of these energies to be present in our lives, and then we have to learn to cultivate those blessings in ourselves and to generate those blessings and to be that blessing in the world. Now, I think a lot of people get lost in this because they think, oh, how can I be generous if I don't have money? So I have to give up money I don't have. No, 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 no. You can be generous with a lot of things because remember, not everything that you put out onto the tide comes back the way that you put it in. You could be generous with your time and receive money back from the tide. You could be generous with your money and receive money back from the tide. You could be generous with your baking. You can be generous with your art. And there are many ways to generate that generosity. There are many ways to be a blessing out there. And you can always tell who the grifters are because they will always tell you, you need to sow money, especially in my ministry. If you give me the money, then you will be blessed. Well, the problem is, the book of Proverbs tells us if you're asked to give a blessing, then you have received your reward for that blessing. So they have already robbed you by asking you to give the blessing because you're not going to get anything back for that. And that's really true because the hardest thing to understand about this process of radiating blessing out into the world is learning to do it without attachment, which means learning to do it without expecting reward. That means learning to do it without expecting anything to come back. You don't do these good actions so that you receive some kind of a reward, because if you do that, all you've done is kind of woven them back on yourself and they're not actually going to radiate out into the world. Yeah, you can be a blessing in this little place because I think we've all met those people that they kind of show up and they can bring some good things with them, but you don't notice when they're missing, when they're not there. And that's because they didn't have that lasting effect. They were just the people that were there delivering their blessings at the time. So learning to be selfless in this giving, like the child in our story of the Selkie, where he knew that he was going to lose his mother to the sea. He knew that he was going to be left with his selfish father. He knew that he couldn't go with her, at least not yet. He was too young. He knew what he was giving up, but he needed to return to the sea. So he was willing to make that sacrifice for her, not knowing if he would ever see her again. And then he gets to see her every night as she brings food to the shore for him and is no good father. Every night he gets to see her. And this is a process that we see working out in nature, where we've learned that various plants will actually share nutrients with each other through their roots. That if one plant is struggling to find a specific nutrient that is rich in another area, the plants will actually transfer the nutrients to each other through their root system to help each other grow. That, yes, competition does exist in nature, but there's also a lot of cooperation that we tend to look past because competition is a more exciting story to tell. So how can we practice blessing? How can we practice this art? How can we be a practical blessing in our community? Well, we can develop a gardener's heart. You can do this through sitting in meditation and just see your heart begin to radiate light. There are many meditations for this. Lama Surya Das, in several of his books, actually has a bodhisattva meditation where you envision before you, you visualize in front of you a saint or deity. To you is the um, epitome of compassion, and you see light go from their heart to your heart, and then you radiate that out. That you take on this power from them. That's a very powerful practice to do, and if that feels like something that you're called towards, then definitely do that. But even without that initial visualization, you can visualize this light flowing from your own heart. You can see your heart as a well, a spring that's overflowing with waters, and those streams are going out towards your loved ones. This is a great way to work on that subtle energy level that we're going to be talking a lot more in episodes to come. But it also reminds you of that great web of interconnectedness that you're in. Because when you start thinking about who your loved ones are and who you want to send this compassion to, you start seeing that web that you're living within. You could offer protection to them in the same way. You can offer healing energy to them in the same way. You can do this without ever telling them that you're doing this for them. And even if you see the fruits of these blessings growing up in their lives, fight that urge to sit back and go, well, I've been sending you blessings. So it's good to see that that's actually working. And by the way, that's a hard thing to fight. Our egos are very strong and powerful things, but try to fight it. Try to fight it as best you can, because this isn't about our ego and this isn't about our expectations. We have to make sure that we don't fall into the new age, it's all about me, that's out there, that turns us into one of those people that just whines into themselves because that makes them so much more spiritual. Because that's not what this is about. This is learning to give in secret, as Jesus says, so your Father who is in heaven can reward openly. It's about learning this process of being that blessing, being that source of gratitude, of hope, of calmness, of joy, of healing, of protection.
I think the biggest part of it is learning that interconnectedness that exists in community, that we are individuals, but we are also just dramatically interconnected with all of the other individuals actively in our lives and just around us,
Yeah.
passively around our lives, and learning to live in that right relationship. Because as that gardener, we want that, say, tomato plant to grow, and it needs a certain amount of nutrients, but there are going to be other plants around it. And being aware of how those other plants will impact a tomato plant will help that tomato plant to be better and help those other plants to be better. And it's all of that. That's part of that gardener's heart in developing, is recognizing that a tomato plant doesn't grow by itself. There is no a tomato plant. It is all the plants.
And this is the initial state. If you're going to want to do any of the magic that we're going to talk about later, such as the magic of change, the alchemical magics, the magic of making, you have to start here, because in starting with this basic life of blessing, you start learning to not only see, but to feel those interconnections with the world around. We're actually going to go deeper into this in the next chapter, where we start talking about our relationship to the world and the seasons and everything else. But it starts here, small, intimately in your life. And it could just be you and your circle of close friends. It could be you and how much your heart is torn because of some event happening around the world. But you start finding those threads of compassion, those threads of connection, no matter how widespread or how close in. And the more you notice them, the more you notice them. The more you notice even subtler ones that are connecting you to this wider and more expansive world.
Going back to that gardener analogy, it allows you to gain that awareness where you realize the other plants in that environment impact the rainfall, which helps to determine how much water it impacts, the humidity, how much humidity. And all of that is because of how all the other plants do, not the tomato plant that you're trying to grow. Simple stuff like that, which is also really complex. But as you get into it more and more, you start to see a lot of those interconnections.
So in chapter 2, we learned the Selkie story. We learned more about the law of the returning tide and the web of Wyrd that we're all living in. And we took our first steps into the spiritual gardening that's going to help us to see our connections to the worlds around us, so that as we go deeper and deeper into our magical practice, we already feel those connections and we're building up, so that when we want to do some of the bigger things, we have those connections already available to us. So don't think you can sleep on this stage. You need to start here, because it will make everything from this point out a lot easier. And a lot of people want to skip the stage and go right to the flashy magics. Well, I want to cast a spell for money. I want to cast a spell for my sick friend. I want to cast a spell. We'll get there. Right now, we're not doing spells yet, but you can sit and you can send your energy, that compassionate, loving, healing energy to them during your meditations. And learning to do that will empower you so much more when we get to actually casting that spell to help them.
Plus, if you end up sleeping on this stage, you might fall in danger of somebody snatching your skin and then you being compelled to do things for them for the next 7 years.
Yeah.
And no one wants that in their life.
Nobody wants that. Alrighty. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it helped you out. I would love to know in the comments, what was your favorite part of this chapter? I think mine is the analogy of the spiritual gardener. If you notice, we talked about that the most. I did like the Selkie story, but I think the spiritual gardener one was my favorite part. But I would love to know what yours is. If you're listening to us on YouTube or Spotify, you can leave a comment right there. If you're listening to us anywhere else, even if they say you can leave a comment, they don't notify us, so we don't know. You leave a comment there anyway, because engagement is magic. But then head over to creationpaths.com and click on chat. There you can leave a comment that we will see and be able to get back to you, because I would love to know what you took away from chapter 2. Don't forget, if you have any questions, we're going to be doing a Q&A at the end of this series. So if you have any questions or anything that you would like to dig deeper into, please put those in the comments as well, so that we can help you out in learning the arts of Druidcraft for yourself. Before we go, I always like to end with a prayer, and I think it's only fitting that we begin with a prayer to Bridget. Oh, sweet Bridget, Our Lady of the Well and the Healing Water, and the Goddess of the Forge, the crafter of implements of war and living, the Goddess of the Hearth Fire, who inspires the mind of the poets. Help us to see the interconnectedness between all things as you have, and to bring that healing water where it is needed, and to bring that fire to bear to craft what is needed in its time of need. Give us sight that we might see, and give us the wisdom to know when we need to keen as you do for the sorrows of the world, when to be creative, and when it is time to transform. Amen.
Amen.